I'm David Shoebridge, one of the Greens MPs in the New South Wales Parliament, and I'm the Justice spokesperson for the party in New South Wales. With Justice also comes the police portfolio, so they all sit nicely together. I'll start this presentation by acknowledging it's Aboriginal land we're on and pay my respects to the elders past and present. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and as an MP I'm part of the institution that, like a sort of sausage machine factory, keeps passing laws and resourcing programs that continue to dispossess and disempower First Nations people. I'm part of the problem. We're all part of the problem whenever we're not standing with First Nations people and demanding justice. So I give that acknowledgement at the outset. I'm happy to leave that photo up because it kind of is a nice way of talking about police and police programs and how we respond to police programs. I had a detailed PowerPoint for my presentation yesterday, and I found everybody looking at the PowerPoint and not looking at me, and as an MP that's very unnerving. So I decided I'd try it without a PowerPoint today and see how we go. 3 programs I want to talk to you about. 3 programs run by the New South Wales Police, paid for by you, to the extent you all live in New South Wales, and 3 programs that are designed to diminish us as citizens, and 3 programs that are designed to be racist and biased and targeted against minorities in how they operate. And 3 programs that I'm committed as a Member of Parliament and as the Greens Justice spokesperson to ending as best we can. I'll tell you what they are at the outset, and then I'll just work our way through each of them. The first program is called the Suspect Target Management Program, STMP. The police like referring to it as STUMP. Who here's heard about the Suspect Target Management Program, or STMP? No? We've got one. Well, there's one reason why none of you have heard about it. Well, sorry. So STMP is the one program. The next thing I'd talk about, the second program we wanted to spend a bit of time on, is the Drug Dog program and the appallingly damaging drug dog program, and I'll talk at it from a sniff-off perspective because my office, together with the Young Greens, runs the sniff-off campaign, which is focused on ending the drug dog program. And the third program I thought I'd speak on is mobile drug testing. The bizarre program that pretends to be about road safety, but is in actual fact a hopelessly expensive and damaging war on drugs by another method. So STMP, Suspect Target Management Program, drug dogs, and mobile drug testing. They're the 3 police programs that I thought was worthwhile to explore in detail because they all have very similar elements to them. Suspect Target Management Program. There is no law in place through the New South Wales Parliament that has created the Suspect Target Management Program. There's no part of the Police Act or the Law Enforcement Power and Responsibilities Act or the Crimes Act that says the police should have a secret way of targeting and monstering people in New South Wales. So, absent any law, the police just went off and created it all themselves. And the Suspect Target Management Program at any given time has about 1,800 people on it. About 300 to 400 of them are children. Young people aged 9 to 17. And the 1,800 people or so that are on the Suspect Target Management Program don't know they're on it. How do you know you're on the Suspect Target Management Program? How do you know you're on a secret list generated by an algorithm created by the New South Wales Police? This is how you know. Every time you leave your house and walk down the street, you're stopped by police. You're interrogated by police. You're searched by police. You're harassed by police. You're pulled over in your car. You're pulled over as you walk. You're bailed up in the pub. Police knock on your door. That's how you know you're on the Suspect Target Management Program. And it is not essential to have committed an offence to be on the Suspect Target Management Program. And the obvious demonstration of that is a child as young as 9 has found themselves on the Suspect Target Management Program, constantly stopped and questioned and harassed and searched by police. And of course, if you are aged under 10 years of age in New South Wales, you cannot commit a crime because there's no age of criminal consent, doesn't kick in until at least 10. So you don't have to commit an offence. But then the police determined by a series of indicia, which they refused to tell us, they refused to release to Parliament, they refused to release to the public, they refused to release under Freedom of Information requests, and they refused to release to a bunch of academics who studied this with the Youth Justice Coalition. But following some interrogation of the individuals who were caught and a number of police who responded to one-off requests by the academics, it was clear that young people were finding themselves on the Suspect Target Management Program, or the STMP list, if they were wearing the wrong type of clothing. Turns out wearing a hoodie, regularly being found wearing a hoodie, is a good way of finding yourself on the Suspect Target Management Program. Belonging to the wrong family is a good way of finding yourself on the Suspect Target Management Program. And apparently there's a lethal combination in Sydney at least, which is if a young person is wearing what's called Nautica-style clothing, which I had to research myself. It's the kind of UK-style thin sports tracksuits, if you can picture those, with a thin sort of nylon-y style tracksuit material with a hood. If you're wearing Nautica-style clothing and you're in the last carriage of the train, well, bang, apparently you find yourself almost immediately on a suspect target management list because the police think you're the kind of person we want to target. Just imagine that though. You're a young person, you're a 9-year-old, there's dozens of 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds. And as you go about your daily business, walking down to the shops, every time the police see you, they pull you over, they question you, they interrogate you, they harass you, they ask you to empty out your backpack, they do all sorts of abuses of your civil liberties, all without any legislative mandate. We only found out about it because some academics started having reports to them that these kids in particular were regularly being stopped and they couldn't work out why they were constantly being stopped. And then a couple of police had accidentally let slip that the kids were on this STMP program, which previously nobody had known about. And it kind of leaked out of the police. Last September, in budget estimates, I decided to interrogate the police commissioner about the Suspect Target Management Program, the STMP. And a number of things came out of that. First of all, that's when we found out and confirmed that the age of the youngest person on this secret police list was 9. That's when we found out and confirmed there were between 300 and 400 kids at any given time on the Suspect Target Management Program. And that's also when we found out a couple of other deeply disturbing things about the program. Of the 1,800 people who are on the program, 55% of them are, see if you can guess what characteristic 55% of the people on the Suspect Target Management Program had. Indigenous, Aboriginal, absolutely. And they make up 2.5% of the population. We then decided to interrogate further, particularly on the kids, that 300 to 400 kids who are caught up in this sort of ugly machinery. And we asked about their racial profile as recorded by the police, and it turns out police are really crap actually at identifying people's racial profile. One police officer will call someone Indigenous, the next will call them Torres Strait Islander, the next will call them Anglo-Saxon, and there's a mess of identities. But when you eventually unscramble all that data, it turns out of the kids, about 52% of the kids who are on that list are Aboriginal, Indigenous kids, 51%. And that means if you're a young Aboriginal person in this state, you are 18 times more likely to be on that secret watch list than a non-Aboriginal person. 18 times. That's not 100% more likely, or 200% more likely, or 500% more likely. That is 1,800% more likely to find yourself on the secret stop and search list from the police if you're Indigenous than if you're not. Disgraceful. And it gets worse, because we then dug down further into the data and we did an analysis on what's the likelihood if you're aged under 15. So we had the ages of the kids. What's the likelihood if you're aged under 15 to be on the list if you're Indigenous as compared to non-Indigenous? It is 31.5 times more likely to be on the list if you're aged under 15 and Aboriginal than if you're non-Aboriginal. when we put some of that data, we didn't have all the data at the time, I put some of that data to the Police Commissioner last September. And I asked him, how can you justify a program that so grossly over-targets Aboriginal people who are already grossly, excessively targeted by policing activities? How do you justify that? And he sort of ducked and squirmed and he said, the policy doesn't have the word Aboriginal in it, the policy itself is not racist, the policy is just, neutral, it just happens that, Aboriginal people are 18 to 30 times more likely to be caught by it, it's not really racist. There's only one way to describe that police program. Only one way. Systemic racist policing in New South Wales. Systemic racist policing. And it follows on from 230 years of systemic racist policing, and it's not going away. And you've got to ask yourself, if we're doing that now in 2018, when the data is so clear, when the evidence is unambiguous, and when Aboriginal kids as young as 9 are finding themselves targeted systemically by police, what is wrong with our society? What is wrong with our police force? When will we get it? When will we get it? So all of you go away today, Google STMP, Google Aboriginality, tell your friends and neighbours and community about it, and let's call out racist policing when we see it, because that program has no legislative basis, and I think it should have no social basis in this state or any other part of Australia. So talking about programs with no social justification, it's a good way of getting on to drug dogs, isn't it? Drug dogs in New South Wales. Drug dogs in New South Wales were first introduced during the Olympics in Sydney, 2000-2001. And they were designed as some kind of general safety tool. And at the time, Bob Carr was the premier, and the police wanted drug dogs and dogs. They had a whole bunch of dogs. They had a fair bit of money for the Olympics. Give us some dogs, give us some dogs. And he gave them some dogs. And they started a drug dog unit. At the end of the Olympics, they didn't have anything really to do with their dog unit. Most of the dog unit had been designed to do explosives and firearms, and they had quite a big apparatus. And so the police came to the New South Wales government and said, we've got a lot of dogs, we like dogs, they're nice. We've got a bunch of police who like handling dogs, we like having a dog unit. It plays well when we go to the media and we have police standing with dogs because dogs are nice. People respond nicely to dogs. We want to continue it. Maybe we can convert it to a drug dog program. And the New South Wales government said, that sounds great. That sounds like a really good PR thing. You can have an expanded drug dog unit, keep all the dogs you currently have, get a couple more, and we'll have a drug dog unit. And they passed the law that empowered the police to use their drug dogs to check for drugs in licensed premises originally, so anywhere that was selling alcohol, and then wherever warrant was issued by the local court to allow drug dogs to operate. Turned out police didn't like the warrant thing. It was kind of a pain in the neck, a lot of paperwork and bureaucracy. So then, over time, the New South Wales Parliament has expanded where drug dogs can operate. They can now operate anywhere there's a licensed premise. They can operate on pretty much any public transport in New South Wales. I pointed out yesterday that's not a huge problem for Nimbin, is it, given how crap the public transport is in regional New South Wales, but in places like Sydney and Newcastle and Wollongong, all up and down the coast, there's a very substantial footprint of drug dogs. And they can also operate in specified areas of Sydney. So all up and down the main street, George Street of Sydney, in King's Cross and parts of Oxford Street and the like. But they also operate when warrants are issued. And so that's when you'll see them at every single music festival. Pretty much, you'll see drug dogs at every single music festival. You'll see them on all our train stations, you'll see them on our major streets in our major cities, and you'll see them, I understand they're operating just the last couple of days in Nimbin, that would have been subject to a warrant. They would have got a warrant to allow the dogs to just go back and forth in the streets in Nimbin, just screening the population to see if they have drugs on them. Why is this a problem? Why is it a problem to have drug dogs, doing harm minimisation work by the New South Wales Police? Well, first of all, they are woefully inaccurate. The dogs that are attached to the Public Transport Command and that do the work in the Public Transport Command Guess how often they get it wrong as a percentage? 90's too high, actually. It's 80%. You guys are very cynical. They get it wrong 80% of the time in the public transport command, 80%. The standard drug dog operations across the state, they have a false positive rate of anywhere between 60 and 80%. They're getting it wrong 60 to 80% of the time. Can you imagine any other government-funded program that was wrong 3/4 of the time and had been wrong 3/4 of the time for the 16 years it had been in operation? Could you imagine, well, apart from coal, could you imagine any other seriously funded government program continuing in those circumstances? And when we talk about money, the drug dog unit itself costs taxpayers about $9.5 million just for the drug dogs and the police immediately attached to the drug dogs. And that doesn't include all the on costs. But the money is substantially more than that $9.5 million a year to run the drug dogs, because the police standard operating procedures on drug dogs make it clear that every time you've got a dog and its handler at a music festival, that there's a requirement to have 12 general duties police to assist with that single drug dog and drug dog handler. So for every dog and handler, you have 12 other police taken off other duties in your local area command and just spend their time wandering around with the drug dog and the drug dog handler. It's an extraordinary use of resources. And the police are very helpful in some regards. They actually have a schedule of costs for what it costs to hire out the police on a user pays service. So if you're a well-heeled member of the community, you can actually hire police by the hour. And they've got a schedule of costs that tells you how much it costs to hire them by the hour. It costs $23 an hour if you're curious to hire a drug dog. But the actual cost of having a dozen police plus the handler, general duties police plus the handler plus the drug dog, is at least $2,000 an hour. At certain music festivals, they can have up to 7 dogs. So last summer at Secret Garden, they had 7 drug dogs operating at Secret Garden on what would have been a minimum 8-hour shift. Now you do the maths, 8 times 2 times 7. We're talking, $100,000 just for that one music festival, just to have the drug dogs there and just to get false positive rates of 50, 60, 70, 80%. Notionally, drug dogs are meant to be there to reduce harm. They're meant to be there to stop drug supply. I'm yet to see an example of a drug dealer being caught by a drug dog at a police station or standing in a queue at a music festival or sitting in a pub. There was one 80-year-old pensioner from Waterloo who was caught with a kilo of cannabis in her handbag at Redfern. And the police were so excited. They were just so excited. They finally got a dealer. That was about 4 years ago. I think she got a Section 10 because she was living in poverty and trying to deal with a whole series of pressing social circumstances. But that's the dealer they've caught, that 80-year-old lady from Waterloo who had a kilo of hash. I think it was hash, so it was a reasonable chunk. She had a kilo in her handbag. That's their one success. Turns out that if you want to transport large amounts of drugs around places like Sydney and Newcastle and regional New South Wales, you don't do it on public transport. Turns out you're more likely to do it in your Lexus or your BMW or your sort of more recent sports car than you are with an Opel card and public transport in New South Wales. So it doesn't work. It doesn't stop drug dealers. It has an active harm creation tool at music festivals. What's pretty clear about drug dogs is they're more often responding to the subconscious signals they're getting from their handler than they are from actually identifying drugs on people. And they're actually reading the human interplay, because they're a pack animal, and they're reading the human interplay much more than they are picking up the smell and scent of drugs and the like. And there's a whole lot of studies of regular ecstasy users in Sydney and other major cities who say, if you have drugs on you and you see a drug dog operating, provided you walk past with an air of confidence, you never get stopped. You never get stopped. But if you show signs of anxiety and a heightened sense of, fear when you have something on you when you're walking past, or you're just seeing the police and you have a heightened sense of fear, that's when you're likely to get stopped. And so in those queues at music festivals, a lot of young people, maybe the first time they've been at a music festival, one of the first few times they've seen police, they see a whole bunch of police coming, they get super anxious. And they're the kind of people who get targeted and pulled out by police. But there's another factor that happens in that fear moment. Young people who may have 2 or 3, 4, sometimes 5 pills for friends on them, standing in a queue at a music festival, they see the drug dogs, they see them coming down, and we have this thing called panicked ingestion, and they just take all their pills at once. And we've lost lives because of that. We just have. There's no argument about it. Young people have lost their lives because of that panicked ingestion. So far from being a harm reduction tool, it's actually a harm creation tool. We say to the police, why not have pill testing? And if you're going to have drug dogs, at least have an amnesty bin. So if people are panicked, they can dispose of their drugs safely rather than have this panicked ingestion. They won't come anywhere near it, the New South Wales Police, which is why I think we should all give a round of applause and cheer for the ACT government and Shane Rattenbury, the minister there, who finally got pill testing down at the festival a few weeks ago. Terrific move, terrific move. So let's call it for what it is. It's a PR program which doesn't reduce drug supply, causes active harm, costs us a bundle. But there is some good news about the drug dog program. When I came into Parliament in 2011, and we started, first of all, I took over some of this work from a former Greens MP in the State Parliament called Lee Rhiannon. But in 2011, when I took it over, there were there were 16,459 searches following a positive drug dog indication. 16 across New South Wales, 16,500 of them. That's a lot. And each one of those was a moment where somebody was ritually humiliated by the police. Stopped by police, often surrounded by 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 police, dog next to them, pulled off a train, stopped at a train station, isolated in the corner of a bar, and everybody's looking at them while the police surround them and they empty out their pockets and their backpack and their handbag, they tip it all over the floor, they take off their shoes and their belts. It's humiliating, right? And on an indication from a drug dog that we know is going to be wrong 2/3, 3/4 of the time. It's the daily humiliation of drug dogs. Doesn't affect drug supply, and actually fractures relationships between young people and the police. That's happening. That was happening 16,500 times a year in 2011. And around about 700 to 800 times a year, people were then having the supreme humiliation of being strip searched following that. And again, the false positives on strip searches have always been 2/3 to 3/4, getting it wrong again. So all of that humiliation, nothing found. And if something is found, it's like 1 pill or 1 joint, 2 pills, tiny little bag, no effect on drug supply. But we in 2014 decided to change our campaigning on drug dogs, and we decided to launch the Sniff Off Facebook page, where people could actively take a photograph and identify where the drug dogs are, where they're operating, so that people could avoid them, because nobody should be subject to that kind of arbitrary, crappy, pointless humiliation at the hands of the New South Wales Police. And that has gone off. Sniff Off has gone off. I think last time I checked, we had about 34,000 likes and followers on Sniff Off. And the information is now being regularly shared about where the drug dogs are operating. You'll be surprised to know they're constantly at Redfern Station, which has a lot of Aboriginal people and young people. Vastly more likely to find drug dogs there than at Central or even at King's Cross, as it turns out. But that has been extremely successful. So successful that the police started putting false reports into Sniff Off. Police themselves entering false reports into Sniff Off. And it was only when we actually found out about the false reports and then found out they were police. They weren't the sharpest tools in the shed. They all had their profiles on them and they all went to Charles Sturt University, which is where every police officer went. So it didn't take a genius to sniff out the police. But we eventually had a directive issued. We humiliated those police and had a directive issued so that they could no longer falsely make reports on Sniff Off. The police hate Sniff Off. If you go out at a music festival and volunteer for Sniff Off and hand out the material to people about their rights and the like, I always go and see the police. They always come and see me. We have a cordial exchange. But they always say, we know who you are. We know what you're doing. We know what Sniff Off is. And since we started really kicking up the campaign, we have basically halved the number of drug dog searches in New South Wales. They've fallen to under 9,000 a year now. The police are very wary more wary than ever before about exercising it. They're less likely to be found at Redfern and the places which we've highlighted as the usual targets of police. It's had a real impact because through Sniff Off, we have the entire community now watching the police on this, engaging, highlighting, and exchanging information about drug dogs, crappy drug laws, and it's had a real impact. For me, it's evidence that when you get the community on side and we have a united community against the dumb police program, we can have a real impact. We've basically halved the searches. I think we should reduce them to naught though, and that's my ongoing commitment to actually get rid of the drug dog program. The last thing I wanted to talk to you about was mobile drug testing, MDT. You'll sometimes hear it referred to as RDT, random drug testing. It's actually not random, it's targeted, it's crap. It's now called MDT, or mobile drug testing. You would have all seen them on the way in. I saw 2 units. I'm staying out at Blue Knob, just north of Nimbin. There was a massive unit on the way in. I think two substantial police vans, 10, 20 police, a whole bunch of additional cars, and then there was another one just on the road out to Lismore, about 15 k's down on the road to Lismore. Again, massive police presence. And, yep, okay. Yeah, previously it's been, every entry to Nimbin has had 1 or 2 of these vans on them, people being pulled over. They don't tend to pull me over. I look really middle class and I drive a rental car, so I have been coming to Mardi Gras for years, and I'm really pissed off that they've never pulled me over and given me an oral swab, but would be a good part of the story. They haven't been willing to do that to me. I'll drive back and forth this afternoon maybe and see if I can grab one. The police have been ramping it up. They want to, and they've now got the resources in place to do 100,000 of these oral swabs and searches a year, 100,000. What do they look for? Well, they look for the tiniest possible trace element, the smallest detectable amount of just 3 illegal drugs. Cannabis, MDMA or ecstasy, and methamphetamines. That's all they're looking for. And if you have the tiniest scintilla of any one of those in your system, and the oral swab detects it, you then get taken out of the car, and they put the oral swab through a second test, which is a more substantial machine called a Draeger 5000, I think it's called. And if that shows a positive as well, well then you lose your license basically for 24 hours. You can't drive a car for 24 hours. And the sample then goes to the lab. And about 2 or 3 months later, you get the result from the lab. If you fail the first oral swab, and then you get taken out by the police, they put it in their Draeger 5000. If you pass the Draeger 5000 test, well then you're allowed to go back and drive again immediately. You don't have your license suspended for 24 hours, but then the sample still goes to the drug lab and they still test and see whether or not you failed, and 2 or 3 months later you find out whether you failed. What's wrong with that? Well, the first thing is, it's not really about roadside safety, is it? Because if they're looking for the tiniest detectable trace, and overwhelmingly people are failing it because of cannabis, the tiniest detectable trace of cannabis, well, they're looking for an amount of cannabis in your system that can have no impact on your driving, 0 impairment. You're not a hazard to other road users. You're not a hazard to yourself. There's just no argument about that. No argument at all. And the impact, if you lose your licence as a result of having a trace element of cannabis in your system, the impact, particularly in regional and rural New South Wales, but also in places like southwest Sydney and northwest Sydney, the impact can be absolutely crushing because you can't get to uni, can't get to work, can't go and buy the groceries, can't visit your friends and families, can't keep up with medical appointments, all because you lose your licence, you're socially isolated, and all because you had a tiny trace element of cannabis in your system. It's like losing your licence because you had a beer at a barbecue the day before. It has no rational connection with road safety. It's a It's a war on drugs by another method. And if you think it's kind of fairly applied, think again. The Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, the key criminal law data junkies, if I can put them that way, in New South Wales, the BOCSAR they're called, Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, they did an analysis last year of the rates at which people are being convicted of drug driving in the different local area commands, police local area commands around New South Wales. Now, I'm sure there is some regional variation about drug use. Some parts of the state use some drugs more than other drugs, but there's there's some kind of regional variation. And I would hazard a guess that the northern part of the state, this part of the state uses cannabis more than other parts of the state. But, there would be some variation. But it turns out you are 50 times more likely to be prosecuted and convicted of an offence under the RDT program if you're in the Tweed and Byron Police local area command or police district than you are if you're on the North Shore of Sydney. Not twice or 5 times or 10 times, 50 times more likely to be prosecuted from the Tweed Byron region than you are from the northern suburbs of Sydney. I mean, what the hell is going on there? If not a viciously targeted police program aimed at a particular region and aimed at people that they want to have a go at. You are 30 times more likely to be on the list from the north side of Sydney than from this part of the. You're 30 times more likely to be successfully prosecuted for RDT from here than the eastern suburbs of Sydney, for example. And are you telling me that drug use is 30 times more common here than in the well-heeled eastern part of Sydney? I don't believe that. I don't believe that for one moment. And you're vastly more likely to be caught on a prosecution from if you live in southwest Sydney, Campbelltown and that part of Sydney, than you are if you're on the North Shore. There's like a 20 times differential between southwest Sydney and the North Shore of Sydney. This is not just a war on drugs, it's also a targeted social war. It's a war on people of lower socioeconomic means, it's a war on the usual suspects by the police, and it runs under the guise of road safety program. It is not about road safety. It is not. So when you're campaigning on these kind of things, you wonder about how you can grapple with it, right? As an MP, you want to run a social campaign, you want to get people, you want to highlight how crap this program is. So how do you highlight how crap the mobile drug testing and roadside drug testing program is? That's a kind of challenge. Because you've got on one hand the police media unit with all the resources of the state saying drugs are bad, driving with drugs is bad, we're catching people who drive with drugs, that's bad, that's good, we're doing good. And there's this, this argument that they've focused on drug users and we want to get all drug users off the road, and that's a good thing. Now, I want to be clear that as a member of Parliament, as a member of the Greens Party, I don't believe there is a place for driving on our roads impaired by drugs. If you're impaired by drugs, you should not be on the roads. That's why we support RBT, random breath testing for alcohol. And we know what the level of impairment that is socially acceptable and understood. If you're 0.05 or above, get off the roads. And if you're caught on the roads, lose your licence and have the book thrown at you. But if you're impaired by drugs on the road, it should not matter whether the drug is legal or illegal. The test should be an impairment-based test, and the police should be targeting people impaired by drugs and getting them off the roads. So when you look at the data, what are the drugs most likely to impair drivers? Well, there's a good report called the Wolf Report from the UK. It's 2013 now, but it looked at all the studies from around the world, and it said a couple of things that the government doesn't like. One is it said that prescription benzodiazepines, benzos as they're called for short, are one of the major causes of road trauma on our roads. Extremely likely to be found in instances of road trauma. And there are people driving on our roads with significant levels of benzodiazepines in their system, and they are a danger to other drivers. They show up in the driver fatality and road trauma data, but somebody can be zonked to their eyeballs on benzodiazepines and be stopped by one of these police units around Nimbin. They get their swab, they pass their swab, they're kind of chilled out, they move on, waved through. Cocaine. Turns out that cocaine in New South Wales is at a 15-year high. And particularly Sydney, and particularly one part of Sydney, is at an extreme high level of cocaine use. And it turns out that it's the electorate of Wentworth, which happens to be the Prime Minister's electorate. And there's a National Crime Authority which regularly goes and tests the wastewater outfalls from sewage treatment plants around the country. And they test in the wastewater, they can find out and analyse just what level of drug use there is in each of these population centres around the country. You know, they find a bit of cannabis and MDMA and some amphetamine use. Turns out amphetamine use across the state is kind of lower than cocaine use, but you know, let's ignore the all the excessive reporting about amphetamine use. But guess which sewage treatment plant blows the dial on cocaine? They have a kind of, when they first reported on it, they had a graph, and it didn't fit on the graph the amount of cocaine that was coming out of this particular sewage treatment plant. It was the sewage treatment plant that pumps out the effluent from the good burgers of Wentworth. When they crunched the numbers in the most recent study, their best estimate is that that part of the eastern suburbs in Sydney consumes between 1 and 1.5 kilograms of cocaine every weekend. And so I asked the Roads Minister in Parliament, okay, we know cocaine is a significant contributor to road trauma because we've got the international studies that show it. Cocaine use is on the rise in New South Wales, yet your roadside drug testing program ignores it entirely. And instead you're pulling off people with a tiny, tiny trace element of cannabis. Cannabis tends to be used by people with less social and financial means than cocaine. Study after study has shown that cocaine is the drug of the wealthy, cannabis is more the drug of lower socioeconomic classes and much more evenly spread across society. So how is it you're waving through people who've got cocaine in their system, who are your mates and your donors and the friends of your kids and your kids' friends, and how is it you're waving through those, but you're smashing all these people with trace elements on cannabis? What's going wrong? This isn't about road safety, is it? This is about your war on drugs and your war on poor people. What his answer was this: I've spoken to the Centre for Road Safety and they tell me that cocaine can only be picked up for a maximum of 6 minutes after it's been ingested. And I just looked at him. It was in Parliament. Sometimes you have to bite your tongue in Parliament, so I didn't get up and ask the obvious question, where do your friends get their cocaine if it only hangs around in their system for 6 minutes? Because it's my understanding that if that was the effect of cocaine, it wouldn't be as expensive as it is. But instead I asked him again, you cannot be serious. You're telling me the reason you're not testing for cocaine is because the Centre for Road Safety say it can only be detected for a maximum of 6 minutes after people have ingested it? That is just crap. Go back and test your advice. And he went, well, I'd take my advice from the Centre for Road Safety rather than the Greens any day. And off he went. Well, we've been hammering that. And we've been hammering that, the failure to test for cocaine, and pointing out the social angle of this war on drugs. How people in the eastern suburbs and the well-heeled parts of Sydney and other parts of this state are getting off scot-free while you're smashing people on cannabis, who take cannabis, tiniest amount of cannabis. And the police have hated it and the government has hated it. And just on Wednesday of this week, so it's good timing for Mardi Gras, we voted through laws in the New South Wales Parliament that finally put cocaine on that list. So we now have 4 drugs on that list. And why is that good? It's because the well-heeled and the wealthy and the people who have connections to power in this state are going to be caught by the same crappy roadside drug testing regime as the rest of us, and that's one good way of forcing change upon a crappy system. It was a good day in Parliament on Wednesday, I can tell you that. Yeah, well, I'm not pretending that's fixed things. It's still crap. There's still people going to lose their licence because they've got a tiny amount of cannabis in them. But you've got to take the long game in this in politics. You've got to find ways that you put pressure on appalling systems and force change. And I think we're a lot closer to change now than we were before. And in fact, as part of the announcement when the government finally caved in on cocaine, they also said they're doing a longer term study on how to include benzodiazepines in the roadside drug testing as well. And the only way you can include benzodiazepines is if you have an impairment-based level. That's the only way you can include benzos. And of course, once we have impairment-based levels for benzodiazepines, as we do for alcohol, we then move the entire regime to that rational level where we're testing for drugs, whether legal or illegal. We're testing at a rational impairment level, and we turn what is a war on drugs into a rational roadside safety program. Yes. Anyhow, you've been a very patient audience. Happy to take any questions. I've got to tell you though, when you stand up in Parliament on these things, you don't have a lot of friends. You get yelled at, you get attacked, you get pilloried by not just the government, but also by the Labor Party, and also by pretty much the other crossbenchers in the New South Wales Parliament. Our parliaments do not represent the community when it comes to this. Our parliaments are so out of touch on drug law reform and sensible policing reforms that it is not funny. The special interests have captured our parliament, and it's time we brought it back and actually had people in our parliaments that represent the broader community, not just the police, and not just corporate players, and not just the usual suspects. Happy to take questions.
Just following on from that, David, across the road this morning, the police were searching young men, and I started to photograph from a distance, and I was told, no, stop. You don't have these young men's permission to photograph. And I said, doesn't matter, kept photographing. And they said, stop. And I said, I don't have to. But pulled up from saying, I went to David Shoebridge's workshop yesterday and I will photograph. Anyway, beside the point, back to roadside drug testing.
So, and they didn't do anything, did they? Once you called them out on it, you could stand there as a citizen and photograph the police. Well done.
Absolutely.
In fact, round of applause for that.
Absolutely, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Roadside drug testing. As a woman, yes. To sit in a car and have a man in a uniform bearing down onto me, demanding that I open my mouth so that I shove something into it, and he takes my licence in the meantime and makes me wait in that car. I know it's going to come back safe. However, I've still got to sit there and wait, and in case that stupid test says, oh, she's positive, I have to then go and drool for, 20 minutes, another oral cavity experience, only to lose my licence, end up before courts and be dismissed on a Section 10. I would like to see this go into a civil liberties. It's a human rights issue. To have a man standing over me, commanding me on what I do with my mouth and what I put in it is outright wrong.
I think your point's well made. We have almost no rights in Australia, particularly in New South Wales. We don't have a Bill of Rights at a state level, we don't have a Bill of Rights at a federal level, and we should have a growing movement to get a Bill of Rights, so some of those arguments could be actually ventilated in courts. But in New South Wales, the law basically says that the New South Wales Parliament can make any crap law it likes, pretty much any crap law, provided it doesn't come into conflict with a Commonwealth law. So they can pass the law that allows the police to do that. Look, I'm on the kind of libertarian fringe of the Greens. That's where my politics are. I kind of believe the state should largely get out of our lives unless there's a compelling reason to have it in your lives. But I do see a place for the police testing people randomly, whether or not they're impaired by drugs while driving. Because I don't want to be sharing the road with people who are impaired by drugs, who are high on cocaine or, zonked to the eyeballs on benzos. And I don't want my kids and people I care about to be sharing the roads with people who are impaired by drugs. What is so offensive about this program, though, is it is so expensive. There are so many police resources being used on this rather than on things like tackling domestic violence and things I'd like the police to be doing. And it's all on the basis of ideology rather than safety. That assault on your civil liberties may be acceptable if it was for a genuine road safety purpose. But when it's not, well, I think that's when you have every right to be as offended as you are, and I join with you. Yep.
More questions? Oh, yep.
Hi, I've got cancer, so I applied for compassionate, whatever the federal police call it, but that thing where you apply for compassionate use of marijuana. So I got a thing back from them which says I can I'm allowed to have a very small amount of cannabis on me. If I get pulled over for a drug test, do you know the likely outcome of that scenario?
Yeah, I do. The likely outcome is you will fail it. The likely outcome is you will then get a prosecution notice in the mail. You'll then go to court, and then you'll be convicted, and then you'll be sentenced. It's the likely outcome. The first time you might get what's called a Section 10, which is actually no conviction recorded. They note the offence was proven, but no conviction recorded because of your compassionate circumstances, and I would hope you would. Most magistrates would give you a Section 10 on the first occasion. But on the second occasion, the magistrate will be compelled to take your licence off you and give you a minimum disqualification period, because the law says magistrates are not allowed to give you 2 Section 10s within 5 years for the same drug driving offence. It goes to show how irrational this program is. On the one hand, you've got the federal government and to some modest extent the state government saying we need medicinal cannabis. It's a way of dealing with pain and pain management in particular. And thank you for sharing your story. And, you know, our thoughts are with you. But on the other hand, you have the roadside drug testing program, which is ignoring it entirely. And in fact, a few years ago, when there was all this push and shove about medicinal cannabis around the country, one of the main reasons it was so slow to get out of the starting blocks was because a bunch of police, the New South Wales Police and others, put submissions into that state and federal reviews about medicinal cannabis and said, don't do medicinal cannabis because it's going to screw up our RDT programs. Talk about the tail wagging the dog. Yeah, so it's incoherent policy, writ large. That's another angle we use to seek to delegitimise it. And,
sorry, just to finish, my objection to that whole thing is that I'm responsible, so if I'm on a high from it, I don't drive. But, you know, my levels of THC would be quite high overall. Mm-hmm. So 3-4 days later, if I haven't taken anything, I'd fail a test.
You may well. You may well.
It's not just, really.
Well, tell me about it. That's why I say this is not about road safety. It's not about whether you're an impaired driver or not. This is just that never-ending war on drugs, and I've got to say it's a social war as well, dressed up as a road safety program. All right. Any other questions? Yep.
Do you feel like there's any hope for the retraction of a lot of the petty, smaller charges, particularly based around cannabis in Australia, like some of the programs in America where they...
Well, I've got to say the Richard Di Natale has federally launched the legalisation campaign on cannabis, and, you know, good on him. Good on him. I think we should be doing a lot more at a state level as well to legalise cannabis. Look, if you asked the ordinary citizenry of New South Wales or Australia, should we just get over this ridiculous attack on cannabis and legalise it? We'd win that in a referendum. And if you asked anybody who's informed on it, who'd actually done the analysis and looked at where we're going, you wouldn't just win, you'd have this landslide of outcome. I reckon, I said earlier that our parliaments don't reflect our population. And they do, and in Parliament, you're constantly getting approached by special interests and stakeholders and people who have got an axe to grind and the money to grind it with. And that doesn't reflect the community. And so they sit in there, the police minister sits in there and he has the police in their ear, and the police get a lot out of the war on drugs. They get extra resources, they get extra powers, they get power over the population like nothing you could believe out of the war on drugs, and they love it. The overall police. There are plenty of individual police who realise how stupid it is and who hate the idea of spending so much of their time, you know, catching small-time pot dealers and busting people for possession when they actually would like to do proper policing, you know, focus on domestic violence, crimes of violence and the like. There are plenty of police who hate it as well. And, you know, I understand how that must be shit for them and must make their job shit. But the New South Wales Parliament is quite out of touch with the community. But that being said, I reckon if we get a change of government, we've got a March election coming up. We get a change of government, which we should get, there's a fair chance that in that first term of a new government, particularly if it's a minority government, where they don't have absolute control, and we've got enough people who are rational on drug law reform in the crossbenchers who have power. Particularly in that scenario, I can see us going down the sort of Colorado path, the rational path on drug law reform. And imagine if we had a tax on cannabis and we put every dollar that we get from the tax on cannabis into our public schools, and we had a rational drug law reform, and we had globally well-funded public education all out of the same policy. That's a policy I'd get behind. We will get there, I reckon. We'll get there.
I'm just wondering if there's any research being done into the storage of the saliva tests, like are the police using that later to DNA test people?
I haven't looked into it, and it's a great point. I will go away and look into it. Can I say on the roadside drug testing, to actually give credit where credit's due, I got a call from Michael Balderstone about 4 to 5 years ago, and he said to me, and Michael's from the Hemp Embassy here, and he said to me, David, there's this problem, right? We've been smashed on roadside drug testing, it's not fair, it's terrible, have you had a look at it? And I said to him, I haven't had a look at it, Michael, what's the problem? He goes, oh, everyone's losing their licence because of cannabis, they're all being caught with cannabis. And I thought at the time, oh, Michael, he's always going on about cannabis. I've got I've got all these other portfolios to do. Maybe Michael's exaggerating. But I got a lot of time for Michael, and I've got a lot of time for the Hemp Embassy and the work you do here. And I said to Michael, I will look into it. I'm not saying I will definitely do anything on it. I promise you I'll look into it, though. And I went away, and that's when we put a freedom of information in, and we got the standard operating procedures from the police about how they use their roadside drug testing. And like on page 1 of it, page 1 of the police's own documents, it says in bold type, this program does not test for impairment. It simply tests for the presence of drugs. It says it in their own documentation on bold. And I thought maybe Michael's onto something here. And then we did the further research and the study, and not only was he onto something, he was dead right. And he's got a good political radar, that bloke. And so the work we do on that comes from Mardi Gras and Nimbin and credit where credit's due. So I promise, having got that question at Mardi Gras, to do the work on where the storage is going.
Yep.
And maybe I'll come back next year and tell you. Yep.
I was going to say one more question, David. I'm sorry if people have other questions. It's really interesting, but encourage you to talk to David personally afterwards. We've got 2 more speakers, and we've got to wind up before the very loud combi convoy and 4:20 happen, guys. So we've got to wind up by 4. So one last question for David.
Well, I'm very concerned as a GP. I've started prescribing medicinal cannabis. I obtained approval within the last few weeks for 13 patients. What advice do I give them? They're taking cannabis legally obtained through the general practitioner. I'm writing a certificate that they're taking this for a medical condition, but if they're stopped and drug tested, is it going to be considered by the police, or are they still going to be persecuted?
It's just as I told that gentleman earlier. Your patients who are taking it on the direction and prescription from a GP, that is not a defence under the roadside drug testing program. On the first occasion, when they're found to have failed the MDT test, the roadside drug test, on that first occasion, I would imagine that once the sampling and the testing goes through, a magistrate is likely in court to give your patient a Section 10, conviction proved but no charge, but conviction proved but no conviction recorded, and they won't lose their licence. But on the second time, they're going to lose their licence. The magistrate has no discretion. They have to take the licence off you on the second occasion, off your patient on the second occasion. If you wanted to point out, and your question does, it highlights the insanity of drug law policy in New South Wales and Australia, you've just done it. It's time we fixed it. Thanks very much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much.